Well, my little boils and ghouls, have you seen enough? The rickety plywood stage in front of the screen creaked as he leant on the edge of a massive operating table. There was no moon that night at the drive-in, and with the projector now dark, he was lit only by a few headlights from the first row. A smile spread over his face like a wound as he looked down at the group of us who had pushed up as close as we could get. Have you seen enough carnage? He sneered. No, we said. Have you seen enough suffering? He demanded. His face was painted like a corpse, but his eyes, set deep in pools of black grease paint, were wild and crackling with life. He pounded his fist down on the table with every word like a revival preacher. No, we said. Have you seen enough horror? He teased. The blinking neon from the exit sign splashed blood red against the spiderweb of scars running up the side of his face and the white shirt under his dusty black suit. He locked eyes with each of us and knew our answer before we did. No. That's what I hoped you'd say, he cackled, running a hand through his greasy black hair. A good thing, too, 'cause I got another hot one coming right up. Makes me hungry just thinking about it. A little number called The Blood Feast. He strutted around in front of a table, crouched on the edge of the stage and smacked his lips. The headlights cast gargoyle shadow against the huge whitewashed screen behind him. Which reminds me, he said sweetly, while my creatures are threading up the next feature, you may want to take the opportunity to patronize the concession stand. He shot a mischievous glance over his shoulder to the side of the stage where he had parked a ferocious black hearse at the start of the show. Creeping towards the car, his voice dropped back into a simmering growl. Of course you might be like me, he smirked, opening the back of the hearse. And you packed your own snack. In two jerks, he pulled and thrown a lean, black, oblong box out of the back of the car. It landed on the stage with an echoing thud and some muffled cries. He threw open the lid, reached in, and pulled out a girl. Blonde and long-legged. She looked about our age, maybe older. Like the girl next door, but none of us recognized her. She was in her underwear, wrists tied with rope, long black streaks of tear-soaked eyeliner running down her cheeks, barely able to stand from the shaking. Come here, sweetheart, he said, pulling her roughly by the arm over to the operating table. She sobbed between big throaty gulps of air that made snotty bubbles rise between her thin pink lips. Each shuddering breath pushed her sweat-covered breasts almost over the edge of the cups of her bra. We were close enough to see goosebumps. He hoisted her up and threw her petrified body on the table, which looked solid, just like in the movies, but it creaked and buckled under the force when she came down. The sound of the slam echoed through the grounds. We held our breath. Please stop, she whimpered. Please don't, we whispered. Shh. his clown face now stretched into a mask of loving concern. "You don't have anything to be afraid of." A flash of light reflected off the long blade he now held above her. "Except me, of course," she screamed. He slashed. The first one drew a wide ribbon of deep red across her throat. The next, across her bare shoulder, nicked the strap of her bra and painted her left arm with the spray. Then another, and then more. Thin slices became a frenzy of wet, hacking blows that rocked the operating table, each one sending splashes of gore into the air and dripping off his maniacal, leering face. Finally, he slowed, wiping his hand through his errant hair, slicking it back into place with blood. He seemed to ponder the scene before him for a moment with the dispassionate look a sculptor gives a marble. And then he dove the blade into her chest, sawing out a small circle. When he finished, he tossed the knife aside, clattered to the stage floor as he tilted his hands and gingerly reached into her. He pulled out her heart and held it gently with both hands. His eyes were fixed on it like a frog that might jump away on its own at any second. And then he bit, wrenching loose a chunk greedily, grinning ear to ear as he chewed, reveling in the taste of our shock and fascination. Once he was finished, he casually wiped the back of his hand across his face, smearing red from the corner of his lip to his cheek. "Hits the spot every time," he said. We cheered. The lights dimmed. The next movie started. A searing white flash of sound burned my dream away. In an instant, nothing remained but shadows and dread and shame. I'd swatted at my clock radio out of instinct, but the noise didn't stop. As my brain struggled to catch up, I crawled over to the edge of the bed and read 4:21 a.m. in radium-painted numbers. The dark of my room felt darker than it should. There was a smell in the air I didn't like. I picked up the telephone receiver from the edge of the nightstand. "Dave," a familiar voice on the other end said gently. "We need you at 19 Halverston as soon as you can." I looked at the clock again and rubbed the gunk that had settled in the corner of my eyes. "Okay, Chief." "Leave your radio off. It's a bad one, Dave." The line went dead and I hung up the receiver. Stumbled over to the shower in the dark and dunked my head under running water for a minute, and then ran a comb through my hair, dug around for a clean-looking shirt and a pair of pants. I eased my shoulder rig on, holstered my .38, and then finished getting dressed before I headed out. I carried my shoes with me down the stairs and put them on when I made it to the porch. My landlady lived on the ground floor of the house, and I didn't want to wake her if I could help it. I slid into my car, unmarked '78 Caprice, and reached for the radio to call in before I remembered the chief's instructions. With a little coaxing, the Caprice started and I eased it out into the street. The car had been new when I was assigned as the head of the investigative unit, a storied and illustrious law enforcement team that to date had been a one-man operation since the chief created it that same year. Wisps of fog snaked off the pavement as I made my way towards Black Hawk Road. The sun wouldn't be up for a couple hours. Amico station sign flickered to life as I drove past, casting long shadows across the parking lot of the Sirloin Stockade. Streets were deserted. Shift change at the IFI meat processing plant wouldn't be for another 2 hours. Around then, you'd see a few more cars headed to the plant, but not as many driving away. After a night of turning livestock into groceries, most of those guys stopped off at the Rail Spike Tap for an hour or two before heading home. Place is a dump, but it's cheap and right by the plant. My first week in town, I went in there early to serve a bench warrant on the owner. First thing I saw was one fella face down on the floor and another guy covered in blood up to his armpits standing over him. I drew my weapon immediately, told him to put his hands on his head. He could barely do it without falling over. The rest of the bar's early morning patrons had a good laugh. That's when I noticed none of them had bothered to wash up after clocking out either. "Welcome to the boys," they said. The boys. Rhymes with noise. French settlers named it, I guess, but they're long gone, so we say it like Americans. We're about an hour and a half south of Iowa City, about that far north of Keokuk and the county seat of Mohegan County. The schools are pretty good, and there's just enough crime to keep me employed. I do my best with what there is. I pull weeds when I find them, but most days I'm just a scarecrow. At the light, I could see a train slithering along opposite the river. Turn signal kept time as the rail cars rolled along. I let myself watch a second or two after the light changed and then made a left at the courthouse, drove up the hill and on to Halverston. The houses on this street are all big, built back when rail traffic was heavy. 19 was easy to spot, a huge Queen Anne flashing blue and red like a neon sign from the lights of 2 patrol cars out front. I parked on the street and saw the chief standing on the porch waiting. I popped the trunk, got my evidence kit, my camera bag, and then headed up to the house. "Dave," he said, with his usual short nod of greeting. "Go in and take a look. We'll talk after." The door was open. Took a quick look at the lock and the door jamb. No obvious signs of forced entry. Walked into the foyer. Floral wallpaper, a little old-fashioned, but in keeping with the looks of the outside of the place. Waxed wooden floors with spiral mats made out of knotted rags. Clean, no footprints or tracked in leaves or mud. Family pictures in frames lining the wall up the staircase. Lights off upstairs and in the room to the right. I could see through an open door straight ahead into the kitchen where the lights were on and a female officer stood with her back to me. I could hear sobs and clinking china from behind her and the KMCD weather report from the room to the left. My eyes followed the sound. Different, but equally old-fashioned wallpaper. Thick, mottled brown carpet that reminded me of the coconut frosting on a German chocolate cake. Oval doily covered coffee table. A big plush sofa with a quilt folded over the back on one side and 2 less comfortable looking but clearly expensive chairs on the other. A well-worn brown leather lazy boy positioned with the best view of the large oak TV cabinet, which was turned on, playing the local morning news at a respectable volume. In the middle of the room was a nude male corpse. I took out my camera, the SLR, not the Polaroid. Took a few shots of the scene before stepping inside the room. The body was completely nude and hung upside down by its feet from a rope secured to a hook in the ceiling that had a fancy plaster medallion around it and probably used to support a chandelier. The same rope hung down to loop around each of the victim's wrists, holding the arms in place at his sides as if he were standing normally, casually upside down. The body belonged to an older man, maybe 60 or thereabouts, slightly overweight. Face was familiar, but I couldn't place it. The throat had been cut deeply and completely across from right below one ear to the other. The skin was very pale, stiff to the touch. I crouched down and took a look at the carpet under the spot where the body hung. It was clean and undisturbed, except for a circular impression, maybe a foot in diameter. I stood up. I could see a neat pile of folded clothes in the seat of the recliner. I snapped some pictures and did a quick look around at the furniture. Nothing else out of place. That's Richard Boyd. I turned around and saw Chief Hayes and Bill Franklin, one of our officers, standing right outside the room. "Boyd's Quality Meats, Boyd?" I asked. The chief nodded. Boyd's had been one of the largest meatpacking companies in this part of the state until he sold out to Innovative Foods Incorporated in the early 70s and then retired. He never ran for office in town, but he kept his fingers in wherever they'd fit. Lions Club, the Boy High Boosters. He sponsored pancake breakfasts on Veterans Day, bought Little League uniforms. He was hardly a Rockefeller, but Boyd was probably the wealthiest man in the county. "Who was first on scene?" I asked. Franklin piped up. "I was," he said. Mrs. Boyd woke up and noticed her husband wasn't in bed and came downstairs. She saw this. Franklin's eyes flitted away from mine to the body. She called the station. She used the old number, not 911, I guess with it being new and all the circumstances. Anyway, I took a while for dispatch to connect, and by the time I got here, she was too distressed to talk. I radioed in and the chief took over. "Did anything get moved or touched?" I asked him. Franklin was pretty good, but this house wasn't what the State Division of Criminal Investigation would call a secure crime scene, and I had a hunch we'd be calling Des Moines for their help sooner or later. When I got here, I heard Mrs. Boyd screaming and crying. The door was unlocked, so I went in to make sure she was okay, and then I checked the house to secure it. Everything was clear and nothing besides this looked out of the ordinary. When I saw this, no, I didn't touch anything. "Has Mrs. Boyd said anything?" I asked. "Mary," said the chief. "No. She's obviously suffered a tremendous shock. Officer Malone has been sitting with her in the other room. Mary and my Sarah have been friends since they were girls. I sent a caller to pick her up and bring her here. I thought it might help, but I'd rather Sarah not see any of this. I'll call for Doc Gurns and for as many officers as we can spare. I'd like to get the body to pathology as soon as Doc signs off." I nodded. "Franklin can help me finish in here while we wait." I handed Franklin the Polaroid and had him follow me around the scene to take more pictures. The Polaroids aren't as detailed as what I can get with my other camera, but they develop right away, and I like to have them for reference. I double-checked the spots I'd looked at when I first walked in and jotted down some notes. After that, we took a real look around the rest of the house. Only the bed, sheets and blanket, disturbed on one side only, and the house was neat and tidy. We came downstairs just as Doc Gurns came in. The Mohegan County Medical Examiner always seemed like an ostentatious title for the plump, gray-haired country doctor, but at times like this, he wore it naturally. He gave me a half smile and then went into the living room. Franklin and I followed and watched as Doc calmly approached the body. He took a small flashlight out of his breast pocket and looked at the eyes, mouth, and ears, and then the wound across the neck. He pinched the skin at the wrist, the shoulder, the hip, and the upper thigh. "Well," he said, "he's dead." "Thanks, Doc. You get pictures of all this?" I nodded. "Go get some guys and a ladder," he said to Franklin. "Anything else you'd care to add at this time?" I asked. The doc eyed the body. "I suspect foul play." "Thanks, Doc." "Sorry," he smiled weakly. "I'll want to wait until after I do a full autopsy, of course," he said, turning back to the body. "But I tentatively estimate time of death at 6 to 8 hours ago. I don't see any defensive wounds on the body, and there's a general lack of discoloration, so it's hard to say for certain." Franklin came back in with a step ladder, 3 other officers, and 2 paramedics with a stretcher. Doc moved out of the way and scratched a few notes into a little notebook. The chief returned while the men worked at lowering the body. "What are we looking at, Dave?" he asked me quietly. "Estimated time of death around midnight. No forced entry. No signs of struggle, which suggests that the victim was either subdued quickly or caught off guard by someone he knew. Rope against the victim's bare ankles suggests the clothes were removed before he was tied up. The victim was then elevated and suspended from the ceiling. Laceration of the victim's throat seems like a likely cause of death, but I'll leave that up to Doc. And no signs of a robbery? Nothing missing?" "Just the blood," I said. Doc grunted and smiled tightly. "Victim is, what, 240, 250 pounds? Hanging upside down like this would force all the blood in his body towards the head and torso. How much blood would that be, Doc?" "Depends how hydrated he was, diet, a few other things. 5.5, 6 liters, give or take," he said. "Cutting clear across the throat. This room should look like a slaughterhouse, but it's spotless," I wondered out loud. The paramedics groaned loudly as they each took one of the body's shoulders and pushed upwards. Franklin teetered on the top of the ladder as he hoisted the body's legs in a one-armed bear hug and fiddled with the knotted rope with his free hand. 2 of the other officers tried to help by pulling on the corpse's hips while the other one held the ladder. After a half minute of grunts, groans, and curses, Franklin managed to get the legs unhooked, and the rest of the men narrowly caught the dead weight. Doc Gurns, Chief Hayes, and I silently watched as they loaded the body onto the stretcher, covered it, and wheeled it out. Chief closed his eyes and pushed his glasses up off the bridge of his nose and started rubbing it with his thumb and forefinger. "Sarah's here. I let her in through the back door so she could see to Mary," he said. "Give them a few minutes before you go in." He straightened and addressed Doc. "I don't think I need to tell you this is a priority. I'm following the ambulance so I can start right away. I'll need to send some samples to the lab in Des Moines, so it may be a few days before I can give you a full report. I'll give the station a call as soon as I have something." The chief nodded and turned to me. "Do you have anything else on your plate for today?" "Nothing that can't wait," I said. Break-in at Lyle's Auto Body night before last. That can sit a few days. Good, he said. Men are taking statements from the neighbors. I want a special briefing with all available officers this afternoon. I asked Sandy to get the conference room ready for 1 o'clock, but if you get a lead, you follow it. Chief Hayes' eyes had started to go a couple of years ago, but he still saw me notice how low his shoulders had sunk. He straightened up, tightened his jaw as he turned to head outside. I need your best on this, Dave. Can I offer you a cup of coffee, officer? Mary Boyd looked like a tiny bird of a woman. She was wrapped tightly in a pink flannel bathrobe, and her short silver gray hair was permed into tight curls. Her eyes were bloodshot, and the remains of tears still clung to the deep wrinkles around her mouth. Please, Mrs. Boyd, thank you, I said, hovering by the square antique table where Sarah Hayes, the chief's wife, sat. Mary, Sarah said gently, let me get that. Mary shuffled over to the cabinet, took out a cup, ignoring her, then filled it at the coffee maker and carried the cup and the pot back to the table with focused determination. Mrs. Boyd, my name is Detective Sergeant David Carlson, I said as gently as I could manage. I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Oh, she said. Do you need cream or... No, thank you, I said, taking the cup and lowering myself into a chair at the table. I cast a quick look over at Sarah. Mary, Sarah coaxed. Detective Carlson needs... Mary said, half choking on the sound before her face crumpled into quiet sobs. The three of us sat like that in the stillness of the kitchen for several minutes. Shafts of weak sunlight coming through the window reflected off dust particles passing through the air like ghosts. Mary Boyd cried softly into the sleeves of her robe as Sarah gently stroked her back. The sun rose a little higher, and I saw her breathing even out. She raised her head, reaching for a paper napkin from a pile on the table to dab her eyes. I'm ready, she said. I listened and asked questions for about half an hour. Mary had locked up the house and gone to bed around 10:30, leaving her husband downstairs in front of the TV. She had been sound asleep and didn't hear anything unusual, although she wore earplugs, as was her habit. Dick snored to beat the band, she said, wiping a fresh tear away. She woke up around 3 and saw that Richard never came to bed. Then she came down to wake him. She said she wasn't sure how long it was before she called the police. She remembered the front door being closed when she came down the stairs, and as far as she could tell, nothing else was out of the ordinary. No memories of strange people near the house or the neighborhood. Nothing different about Richard's behavior the previous few days. No valuables in the house to speak of besides a safe with some cash and Mary's jewelry, both of which were undisturbed. No ideas of anyone who would want to hurt him. That last line of questioning tipped her over the edge of what she could handle in one morning. So I thanked her for the coffee, even though I hadn't gotten around to drinking it, and left my card. Sarah told me she was going to take her over to their place, and I said I thought that was a good idea. Outside, the property line had been traced with yellow tape to secure the scene. A small crowd had started to gather in the neighbors' lawns. KMCD's news van pulled up, and Chief Hayes made a beeline to intercept them before they got too close. I saw Franklin standing next to his patrol car, and more importantly, I saw the paper cup carrier perched on the roof with a single remaining coffee left. I walked over to Franklin and gestured hopefully at the cup. "Help yourself." One of the guys brought those in when they came to canvass the neighborhood. I took the cup and inhaled the steam coming off it. Donut land. Second best cup of coffee in the county. The owner gives it to cops for free, so they'll hang around a lot. He says he likes the security, but I always figured he had a dry sense of humor. A couple of long sips brought me back to life. I looked out at the crowd and tried to get my thoughts into shape. No forced entry, no mess, no struggle. Most of the people hanging around looked to be in the process of being interviewed by one of the officers or repeating their stories to their neighbors. Lots of concerned faces peering over at each other for a look at the house or through the windows. No pulleys or ladders or anything else that might have made hoisting 200 pounds of dead weight any easier. Scanning the faces of the neighbors, one stuck out in sharp relief. Younger than most of them for a start, late teens or early 20s. Chalk pale with a mess of black hair sticking out at all angles. Not a popular look for guys around here, but some of the rougher girls do styles like that. Teased out and stuck into place with a can's worth of hairspray. Tall and skinny, wearing an old blue satin tuxedo jacket over a t-shirt with black jeans. He leaned against a tree, watching the scene from behind big black aviator-type sunglasses. No blood. "Who's that?" I asked. "Who, MTV?" said Franklin. I nodded. He got out his interview book and flipped through a few pages. "James West, 19 years old, 113 Elm. That's a couple of blocks away. He was part of the crowd that started to show up, so we took a statement." "You say why he was over here this time of morning?" "Taking a walk, saw the lights. Said he was taking one last night, too." "Did he see anything?" "Just what everybody else did. Thick fog, like from a movie." "What do you mean, just what everybody else did?" "All the neighbors I talked to that were up late and looked outside say they saw the streets filled with heavy fog. We got some of it up by my place too. Weird stuff. Can't remember the last time it got that thick." "Anything else?" "Yeah." Franklin leaned over to show me his notes, flipping through a few pages as he spoke. "A car. Big one. Maybe a truck. Black or dark colored. Really loud engine. Woke up half the neighborhood a little after midnight. Dispatch was getting complaints like that until about 1 o'clock, but we didn't find anybody. Figured it was just kids racing." "Could have been." I went over to check in with the other officers and try to talk to this James West myself. But by the time I got there, the crowd had grown and he'd slipped away. Clouds were drifting in and I smelled rain in the air. I stood in the middle of the street and stared at the house while I finished the coffee. Du Bois isn't Dodge City, but it's not Mayberry either. We're a little shy of 30,000 residents, and most of what we see here is what we call property crime. Thefts, burglaries, plenty of vandalism, trespassing. We get a fair amount of dope cases, but not near as much as Davenport or Iowa City. But it's been growing each year. The violent crime that shows up on our annual reports and puts our per capita rate higher than Des Moines is almost entirely bar fights, domestic cases, and a handful of times each year drunk driving turns into manslaughter. Up until today, the worst I'd seen here was 3 years ago when Morty Wilcox had it out with his common law wife, Sally DeVore. He had started drinking sometime that afternoon and made it home in time to catch Sally coming off her second shift at the Flying J. They slapped each other around for a while until Sally decided enough was enough and started to gather some things to leave, and took their 4-year-old daughter Sherry with her. Morty begged her not to go. Then he demanded it. And then he got his 12 gauge out from under their bed to make his point. Sally and Sherry were in the doorway when he tripped over the coffee table, accidentally pulled the trigger on his way down. When I arrived on scene, what was left of Sherry was in her mother's arms or on the walls behind her. Sally sitting there sobbing, staring at Morty, who had put the barrel in his mouth and painted the back wall and ceiling. When I looked into that trailer, I saw the horror and the stupidity and the tragedy of what had happened. But I also saw the inevitability of it. No matter how rich the soil is, crops will fail if they're not looked after. Impulsive actions, desperation, selfishness, those all make sense to me. Those are motives I can wrap my head around. I can see where they lead. What I can't see is what could possibly lead to hanging from your ceiling naked. Back at the station, I called Des Moines, but whoever answered the phone at DCI told me to call back later. So I did. That time I got to leave a message.